At first glance, this country looks like a success story. Its skyline rivals some of the most modern cities on the planet. Skyscrapers stretch toward the sky. Massive highways cut across sprawling urban landscapes. Banks, corporations, and stock markets operate at a scale that dominates an entire continent. This is Johannesburg, the financial heart of South Africa, a city often called the economic capital of Africa. Here, billions of dollars move through the economy every single day. The country hosts the largest and most sophisticated financial market in Africa. It exports gold, platinum, diamonds, coal, and countless other valuable resources to the rest of the world. Its industries power much of southern Africa's economy. Its companies operate across multiple continents. By many measures, South Africa is the richest and most industrialized nation on the African continent. But just a few kilometers away from the gleaming towers of Johannesburg's financial district, a completely different reality exists. Endless rows of small tin roof homes stretch across dusty land. Informal settlements expand further every year. Millions of people struggle to find stable jobs. Many families survive on extremely limited income. Electricity cuts out regularly. Public services are strained. Opportunities are scarce. And this raises a question that has puzzled economists, historians, and ordinary people around the world. How can one of the richest countries in Africa still have so many poor citizens? How can a nation blessed with extraordinary natural wealth struggle with such deep inequality? How can the same country contain both extreme wealth and extreme poverty, side by side? To understand this mystery, we must go far back into history, long before modern cities, stock markets, and multinational corporations. Because the roots of this paradox were planted centuries ago, the story of South Africa is not just a story about economics. It is a story about land. It is a story about power. It is a story about who controlled the wealth of the country, and who was left out. And to understand why millions of people still struggle today, we must begin in the distant past. When the first European ships arrived on the southern tip of Africa, in the 1600s, European powers were racing across the oceans. Trade routes between Europe and Asia were expanding rapidly. Spices, silk, and valuable goods moved across the seas, and nations competed fiercely to control these routes. One of the most important stopping points along these journeys was the southern tip of Africa. Ships traveling between Europe and Asia needed a place to rest, repair, and resupply. And that is how European settlers first began establishing permanent colonies in what would eventually become South Africa. The early settlers came primarily from the Netherlands, establishing a settlement in Cape Town in the mid-1600s. At first, the colony was meant to serve only as a supply station for passing ships, but over time, the settlement began expanding deeper into the land. European settlers started claiming farmland. They established farms, businesses, and communities. And, as the colony expanded, conflicts began to emerge with the indigenous populations who had lived on this land for generations. These early struggles over land would become the first seeds of a much larger conflict that would shape the country for centuries. But the true transformation of the region did not begin until something extraordinary was discovered beneath the soil. Because deep underground, hidden for millions of years, were some of the richest mineral deposits ever found on Earth. In the late 1800s, prospectors made discoveries that would completely transform the region: gold, diamonds, and vast quantities of other precious resources. The discovery of diamonds near Kimberley sparked a global rush. Suddenly, fortune seekers from across the world flooded into the region. Mining towns appeared almost overnight. The value of the land skyrocketed. Soon after, even larger deposits of gold were discovered near what would become Johannesburg. This gold rush would eventually turn the region into one of the most important mining centers on the planet. The wealth buried beneath the land was staggering. But there was one critical detail about this wealth. The people who owned the mines were not the same people who worked in them. Powerful mining companies quickly took control of the industry. One of the most influential figures in this period was Cecil Rhodes, a businessman and imperial strategist who played a major role in shaping the region's economy and political structure. Under his influence, and others like him, mining corporations gained enormous power. They controlled land, they controlled labor, and they controlled the profits. Black African workers were recruited to work in the mines under extremely harsh conditions. They performed the most dangerous labor while earning only a tiny fraction of the wealth being extracted from the ground. Meanwhile, mining owners and colonial elites accumulated massive fortunes. From the very beginning, the wealth of South Africa was distributed unevenly. A small group controlled the profits, while the majority of the population provided the labor. This economic imbalance would soon become deeply embedded in the structure of society. And as the country continued to develop, the gap between the wealthy and the poor only grew wider. But the situation would become far more extreme in the 20th century, when a political system was introduced that would legally enforce inequality across the entire nation. A system that would divide people based on race. A system that would shape the economy, the cities, the jobs, and the lives of millions. That system would become known as apartheid, and its consequences would echo across the country for generations. By the early 20th century, the economic structure of South Africa was already deeply unequal. The mines were producing enormous wealth. Gold, diamonds, platinum, and other minerals were being exported across the world. International companies invested heavily, and powerful industrial networks formed around the mining economy. But while the country was becoming richer, the majority of its people remained excluded from that wealth. Then, in 1948, a political system was officially introduced that would transform inequality into law. This system would become known as apartheid. The word itself means separateness. But in reality, it meant something far more extreme. Under apartheid, the population of South Africa was divided into rigid racial categories. Every citizen was classified by race, and those classifications determined where people could live, what jobs they could hold, which schools they could attend, and even who they were allowed to marry. The system created a society where opportunity was reserved almost entirely for the white minority population. Black South Africans, who made up the overwhelming majority, were systematically excluded from economic power. Land ownership became tightly controlled. Laws were passed that restricted where black citizens could live. Entire communities were forcibly removed from valuable land and relocated to underdeveloped areas far from economic centers. Cities like Johannesburg, which were booming with economic activity due to mining and finance, were largely reserved for white residents and businesses. Meanwhile, black workers were often required to live in distant townships and travel long distances to work. One of the most well-known of these townships was Soweto, a massive urban settlement created during the apartheid era to house black workers who were not allowed to live in the city itself. Millions of people were confined to overcrowded townships with limited infrastructure, poor services, and almost no economic opportunities. Yet every morning, many of those same residents would travel into cities like Johannesburg to work in mines, factories, and homes, generating wealth for the very system that excluded them. The apartheid economy depended on this arrangement. Cheap labor powered the mines. Cheap labor built the cities. Cheap labor sustained the industries. But the profits flowed in one direction, toward corporations, toward elites, toward a small minority that controlled the political and economic system. Over time, this imbalance became deeply embedded in every part of society. Education was segregated. Healthcare was segregated. Public transportation was segregated. Even beaches, parks, and restaurants were segregated. But perhaps the most damaging effect of apartheid was how it shaped the country's economic future. By denying quality education and professional opportunities to the majority of the population, the system created generations of workers who were locked into low-paying jobs. Skilled professions, management positions, and high-paying careers were largely restricted to white South Africans. This meant that even as the national economy grew stronger, most citizens could not access the benefits of that growth. The economy itself was powerful, but the wealth remained concentrated at the top. By the 1970s and 1980s, resistance against apartheid was growing both inside the country and across the world. Protests erupted in townships. Students marched in the streets. Workers organized strikes. Activists demanded an end to racial segregation and economic exclusion. One of the most prominent leaders of this struggle was Nelson Mandela. Mandela became a symbol of resistance against the apartheid system. For his activism, he was imprisoned for 27 years by the apartheid government. The system that had once seemed unbreakable was now facing growing resistance both domestically and internationally. Finally, in the early 1990s, the apartheid system began to collapse. In 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. Just 4 years later, in 1994, South Africa held its first democratic election where citizens of all races were allowed to vote. Mandela became the country's first black president. For millions of South Africans, this moment represented hope. After decades of oppression, The country finally had a chance to rebuild itself. The expectation was clear. Now that apartheid had ended, the wealth of the country would finally begin to benefit everyone. The mines were still rich. The industries were still powerful. The economy was still the strongest in Africa. Surely, the end of apartheid would open the doors to prosperity for the majority of citizens. But the reality turned out to be far more complicated. Because while political power had changed, the economic system that controlled most of the country's wealth remained largely intact. And that meant the deep inequalities created during apartheid would not disappear overnight. In fact, many of them would continue shaping the lives of millions for decades to come. When the first democratic elections were held in 1994, the world watched with hope. After decades of racial segregation and oppression, South Africa had taken a historic step toward equality. Millions of citizens who had been excluded from the political system were finally able to vote for the first time. The victory of Nelson Mandela symbolized the beginning of a new era. The apartheid government had collapsed. Political power had shifted. The laws that once enforced racial segregation had been dismantled. But the economy that apartheid had built did not disappear overnight. While political freedom arrived quickly, economic transformation proved far more difficult.
For decades, wealth, land, businesses, and industries had been concentrated in the hands of a small minority. Large corporations, mining companies, banks, and major agricultural enterprises were already deeply established long before democracy arrived. Changing that structure was not something that could happen instantly. When the new democratic government took power, it faced a massive challenge. It had to rebuild a country where millions of people had been systematically excluded from education, skilled professions, and economic opportunity. Entire communities had grown up without access to quality schools, stable employment, or infrastructure, and those inequalities did not simply disappear with a new government. Many of them remained deeply embedded in the structure of society. Even today, decades after the end of apartheid, the country still struggles with some of the highest levels of inequality in the world. In cities like Johannesburg and Cape Town, luxury neighborhoods exist only a few kilometers away from informal settlements where millions of people live in poverty. Modern office towers stand next to communities where unemployment remains extremely high. The contrast can be shocking. On one side of the city, global corporations operate in high-tech financial districts. On the other side, families struggle to find stable jobs and reliable public services. One of the biggest challenges facing South Africa today is unemployment. For many young people entering the workforce, finding stable employment can be extremely difficult. Even though the country has a relatively large and diversified economy compared to other African nations, job creation has not kept pace with the growing population. Industries like mining, which once provided large numbers of jobs, have become increasingly automated and capital-intensive. This means that while the sector still generates enormous wealth, it employs far fewer workers than it. Meanwhile, other sectors of the economy have struggled to absorb the millions of young people entering the labor market every year. The result is a society where economic growth exists, but opportunity is unevenly distributed. Another major issue that has complicated the country's economic progress is corruption and political instability. Over the years, several government scandals have shaken public trust. One of the most widely discussed periods involved the presidency of Jacob Zuma, whose administration faced numerous allegations related to corruption and mismanagement. Critics argued that corruption weakened state institutions and slowed the country's ability to address unemployment, infrastructure challenges, and economic reform. When public resources are mismanaged, it becomes harder to invest in schools, healthcare, energy systems, and other services that are essential for economic development. Energy shortages have also created serious problems for businesses and households. Frequent power outages, often referred to locally as load shedding, have disrupted industries, reduced productivity, and made it harder for companies to operate efficiently. For small businesses in particular, these disruptions can be devastating. Yet despite these challenges, it is important to remember that South Africa remains one of the most influential economies in Africa. Its banking sector is among the most advanced on the continent, its universities produce skilled professionals, its industries continue to export valuable resources and manufactured goods to markets around the world. The country has enormous potential, but the key challenge lies in ensuring that this wealth and potential are shared more widely among its citizens. The paradox of South Africa is not simply that it is rich while many people are poor. The deeper issue is that the wealth exists, but the systems required to distribute opportunity more evenly are still evolving. Decades of inequality cannot be reversed overnight. That it takes time to rebuild institutions, expand education, create jobs, and address historical imbalances that developed over generations. The story of this country is therefore still being written. It is a story of progress and frustration, of hope and struggle, of extraordinary potential alongside difficult realities. But one thing remains clear. Understanding why a nation can be rich while its people remain poor requires looking beyond simple numbers like GDP or natural resources. It requires understanding history, it requires examining power, and it requires acknowledging how decisions made decades ago can shape the lives of millions today. Because the truth is that wealth alone does not determine prosperity, how that wealth is managed, distributed, and invested in people ultimately determines whether a nation truly thrives. And in the case of South Africa, that journey toward shared prosperity is still ongoing. The story of South Africa is a powerful reminder that national wealth does not automatically translate into widespread prosperity. A country can possess extraordinary natural resources, advanced industries, and a strong economy, yet still struggle with deep inequality. History, politics, economic systems, and social structures all play a role in shaping how wealth is distributed, and sometimes, the effects of past decisions can last for generations. But this raises an even bigger question: if one of the richest countries in Africa can still struggle with poverty among its citizens, what about other nations around the world? Are there other countries where wealth exists, but ordinary people rarely see its benefits? That is exactly what this channel is here to explore. If you found this story fascinating, make sure you subscribe now, because we are just getting started. Around the world, there are countless countries with hidden stories, surprising contradictions, and mysteries that most people have never heard about.